Okay, this is Chapter 9, Section 1. We are now in the Jeffersonian era. We are done with the Federalist period. John Adams is no longer president, so this chapter will begin with the inauguration of Thomas Jefferson. Section 1 is called the Revolution of 1800 because that's what Thomas Jefferson refers to his election as, that we are going back to the revolutionary ideals that began in 1776. He thinks that we took a break from them during the Federalist time, and now we're, back to what America should be about. This is a very short section. I think this slide shows only 6 slides. So make sure that you also read through this part of your textbook. It's pages 171 to 175. It stops at the top of 175. Okay, so your objectives for this section today are that you should be able to contrast the political views of the Jeffersonian Republicans and the Federalists. You guys should be able to do that very, very easily. We've been talking about both of these groups now this will be the 3rd chapter. You should explain how the 12th Amendment changed the process of electing a president, which you should already have an idea because we've discussed this in prior chapters. And then the 3rd objective is that you should list and describe the 3 major decisions of the Marshall Court. So this is the only thing that's a little new for you guys. Okay, so the nature of Jeffersonian Republicanism, what makes them different from Federalists. Jefferson himself is just a very different character than George Washington, who leaned a little Federalist. He was kind of that guy in the middle. Definitely different from John Adams. Jefferson is much more informal. He'll receive heads of state in pretty much his pajamas, which will be shocking. But his whole focus is on this idea of the common man. And so those are all kind of illustrations of how he feels that way. So he's concerned, the Jeffersonian Republicans are concerned with the interests of farmers. Remember, they think this country is going to be the best country it can be if everyone owns a piece of land and is invested. So he really believes the farmers are kind of the best people in America. He believes that less government we have, the better off we all are. And where we usually get this difference, or this picture of Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans being different, is we see Federalists being elitists and Jeffersonian Republicans being all for the common people. But Jeffersonian Republicans are also a little elitist. It's just different. It's not an elite of birth. They're after an elite of talent. We want the most talented people governing the country, the smartest people. And pretty much Jefferson is kind of the ideal Jeffersonian Republican. He's this very cultured, very talented man. Okay, so as soon as Jefferson is in office, and remember this doesn't actually happen. He's elected in 1800, but he doesn't begin his administration until March of 1801. He starts making changes. He repeals the Judiciary Act of 1801. If you remember, that's where you got the midnight appointments of all those Federalist judges by John Adams. He gets rid of that. He allows the Alien and Sedition Acts to expire because remember that those were pretty unconstitutional. B, they're just targeted towards the Jeffersonian Republicans, against them. So we don't need to renew that. We get rid of that. And then the 12th Amendment, we've discussed this before. If you remember, when we voted for presidents, pretty much the runner-up got to be vice president. And that could be 2 people that had completely opposing views, and was very complicated and difficult. So we decided we need to make a change there, and that's where we get the 12th Amendment, which lets electors cast separate ballots for president and vice president. So it wasn't this situation of having to just, team up with the guy that you beat or lost to in the election. Interestingly enough, something that Jefferson was very outspoken about and didn't want, the national bank, he leaves that alone. So kind of Jefferson saw the practicality of having a national bank once it was actually here, and he decided to leave it alone. And actually, again, once the national bank's charter is up, it'll be Republicans that renew it. Okay. So then we get to the Chesapeake Affair. And the Chesapeake Affair is a situation that happened in 1807 where an American ship was fired on by a British ship. And so now Jefferson doesn't really know what to do. Like, he doesn't want to declare war because Jefferson, remember, less government. So less government also means smaller army, smaller navy. And so we're not really prepared to go to war. He needs to think of a way to retaliate against the British for doing this. So what he does is he creates the Embargo Act. And that's a typo there. It should have an E on the end of forbade. It's not forbade, it's forbade. He forbade trade with England and France. And France was at war with England at the time, but he just wanted to completely remove us from the picture. And he thought that that would be, crippling to England if they couldn't trade with us. But really what it did, and I mean there's some other parts of this too, because it's not just that he forbade us from trading with Great Britain or France, but he also pretty much didn't allow our ships to go to foreign ports without his permission. And if we had ships leaving our ports, they had to post a bond equal to the value of their ship and everything they were carrying. So pretty much this whole thing just crippled our economy, killed the American economy, and especially the economy in New England. And so there was a lot of Federalists that were really upset with Jefferson and the Embargo Act. And we will look at a political cartoon. It's actually in your book. We will look at a political cartoon. I don't know if we'll look at it on Monday or Tuesday of this week that has to do with the Embargo Act. Okay, John Marshall in the Supreme Court. So John Marshall is actually the 4th Supreme Court Chief Justice. If you remember, we talked about the first one was John Jay. And up until this point, the Supreme Court doesn't get a lot of respect from the other branches in our government. But John Marshall's going to change all of that. John Marshall is a Federalist, and so the Supreme Court ends up being like the last stronghold of the Federalist Party. John Marshall is also Thomas Jefferson's cousin. Interestingly enough, they don't like each other at all. And, that is to be expected since they have such different political views. Anyway, so John Marshall is going to be he's actually on the Supreme Court for 34 years. He's a part of quite a few landmark decisions, and you'll often hear people talk about, like, well, the Marshall Court, set the precedent for blah, 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 whatever it is. And so now, because you took this class, you'll be able to know that they are talking about this time period under this Supreme Court Chief Justice and these different decisions that he made that pretty much, if you sum them all up, they kind of uphold and give strength to the federal government's power over state government. Okay, so the first Supreme Court decision is Marbury v. Madison, and this has to do with the Judiciary Act of 1801. So if you remember, again, that's the midnight appointments of John Adams. So William Marbury is a justice that needs to receive his appointment, his commission. So he actually needs to receive something that says, yeah, you're gonna go here and be the judge. It's not just the Adams appointed you one. James Madison, who's a Republican, refuses to deliver that commission. Okay, so that's where you get Marbury versus Madison. So John Marshall looks at this case and he determines that, hey, anything that I say, I can't force. It is not in the law for the Supreme Court to enforce that Madison give Marbury his commission. I can't do that. But what I can do is tell you that the court has the power to determine what laws are constitutional and unconstitutional. And so he sets up the idea of judicial review, that is the Supreme Court's job. Because before this point, this is a part of the reason why the Supreme Court didn't really have that much power. It was kind of like, what are they doing? What really is their function? Well, this is their function, to tell you if a law is constitutional or not constitutional, and if it's not constitutional, to get rid of it. Okay, Gibbons versus Ogden is the next case. Pretty much in this case, it's an issue of interstate commerce. You have New York trying to grant a monopoly to a company to use the waterways there, and that would have interfered with the federal government's right to use those waterways for trade. And so the decision comes down that we need to protect the government's delegated powers. The Constitution gives the government powers, and we can't have a law that's going to interfere with that. So so Congress is allowed to regulate interstate commerce, and that just upheld that. McCulloch versus Maryland. So you guys remember the National Bank. Maryland hates the National Bank, and pretty much what they try to do is tax the Baltimore branch of the Bank of the United States out of business. And then the decision comes down that states cannot interfere with the federal government's exercise of implied powers in order to protect their delegated powers. So pretty much if the government has delegated powers, and this was all in your vocab, the delegated powers are the powers that the Constitution gives them outright, okay? Now their implied powers are the necessary and proper things that they need to do in order to exercise their delegated powers. Does that make sense? We can discuss this more in class. That way you guys can ask me actual questions. But that's what this court case comes down to, that a state cannot interfere with the government's exercise of their implied powers, where that's going to interfere with their delegated powers. So, moving on, I think we're done, actually. Yep. Here's your paragraph shrink. Power, struggle, republicanism. Remember that when you're going through these lectures, you can take your time, pause, make sure you're making your questions. You know that I'm giving you all of your subheadings there. You can check in your textbook. Okay, let's go through the SRQ real fast as the quick review. How did the Federalists and the Republicans disagree concerning the power of the central government? Attempt to actually answer this. Okay, well, the Federalists wanted a strong central government and the Republicans wanted a weaker one. What is judicial review and what Supreme Court decision established judicial review? Judicial review is the right of the court to declare a law unconstitutional, and it is Marbury versus Madison that established that. And question number 3, list the 3 important court cases that the Marshall Court ruled on and the important long-range principle established by each one. So Marbury versus Madison, we just answered this. That establishes judicial review. Gibbons versus Ogden protected the federal government's constitutionally delegated powers from state interference. McCulloch versus Maryland protected the government's right to enact laws that are necessary and proper to carry out its delegated powers. So protected the government's right to enact laws for their implied powers in order to carry out its delegated powers. Okay, and just a question I want you guys to start thinking about before you come to class. Was Jefferson's revolution really a revolution? And we'll talk about why it is and why it isn't on Monday. Okay, so you will have a quiz over your vocab and this section. Keep just checking course sites. Just make it a habit to check the class to see if there's any updates or discussion forums that have opened up. And as a bonus question, to make sure that you actually watch this entire lecture, there will be a bonus question where the answer is stars. So now you know. Have a good weekend.